This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Neil Lauer, suspender manufacturer and author of The Tripod, a new perspective on the Shalosh Regalim. If you are looking to add a new depth to your appreciation of the Shalosh Regalim and enhance your Yom Tov observance, or just need a Yom Tov themed sefer to read during hakafos, consider The Tripod, a new perspective on the Shalosh Regalim. The Tripod presents an analysis of Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkos and how they work together as a unit to communicate some of the fundamentals of Judaism. It has earned high praise from both its readers and prominent Rabbonim, including Rabbi Jacob J Schacter, who called the work an outstanding, extraordinary, original, and creative analysis of the role the Shalosh Regalim play in representing the most fundamental elements of Jewish faith. The Tripod is available now at your favorite bookstores and online retailers, and I'll include a link in the show's notes as well. It's published by Mosaic Press. I'll include a link to Amazon and to anywhere else, but it is available wherever in any Judaica store. As always, if anyone has any comments, questions, or feedback, please email me, sefarimchatter@gmail.com. If anyone else would like to sponsor an episode or to advertise on the podcast, there's a PayPal link in the show's notes below. You can also email me, and as well as Zelle or Chase QuickPay at that email address, sefarimchatter@gmail.com. And you can also subscribe to the podcast, wherever you get your podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, 24/6. I know I always say Google Podcast, but someone sent to me that Google's podcast is closing down. They're changing to YouTube Music or whatever. So wherever you listen to your podcast, though, any podcast app, and if it's on Apple, if you can please rate and review, I appreciate that very much. I want to thank also those that there was some other donations that I got before Yom Kippur. I guess people felt before Yom Kippur they wanted to say thank you for the podcast. So thank you to those who gave that. I appreciate that. And again, the same information I said before, if you want to donate and support the podcast. And this episode on Koheles, so kind of Sukkos themed. And then, as I mentioned already before the previous episode, but I'll mention here as well, there will be no Spain episode this week. This is coming out on Wednesday. But probably there will be a Spain episode on Chalamayit, and then going forward, we'll be back to Spain and finish up the series, which is almost done. And the next series on Svarim Cheddar is coming pretty soon. So stay tuned for that. Enjoy this episode and have a good Yom Tov. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Cheddar podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by David Curwin, who is an independent scholar who has researched and published widely on a variety of topics. And we'll be discussing his first book, which is titled Koheles, A Map to Eden, an Intertextual Journey, which is published by Magid, division of Corwin Publishers, and also Aleph Beta Press, which is Aleph Beta, which is Rabbi David Foreman, who's been on the podcast before, and they sponsored a couple episodes the listeners are probably familiar. So thank you for joining me. So let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, I grew up in the States. I've been living in Israel for the past 27 years. I studied in what I consider a pretty special institution, is the yeshiva called Yeshivat HaKibbutz Hadati. It was a kibbutz in Sarim. There were a lot of different scholars there who had a number of different opinions. I sometimes view it like as an orchestra, a symphony of different opinions. And I learned a lot of different methods of Torah study, of approaching Tanakh, of approaching Torah in general. Sadly, the yeshiva closed down about 15 years ago, but I still consider myself in a way a student of that yeshiva. And even though I didn't go into anything about, I didn't go into the rabbinate, I didn't go into, I didn't become a teacher. I consider myself a lifelong student of Torah, and I would teach in various opportunities when I had, the opportunity to give shirim or write articles and things like that. And that's I've done that for the past 20 years in my personal life, not in my professional life. As you mentioned, I'm a you mentioned Rabbi Foreman and Aleph Beta. I became about 10 years ago a big fan of his, as many, I'm sure many of your listeners are. I particularly was attracted to his methodology in his what's called intertextuality, where you compare one book of the Torah to one book of the Tanakh to another, or maybe a passage in the same book, but you learn something from comparing two different texts. Very famously, people often notice it when you look at, let's say, Megillat Esther and the story of Yosef. They use a lot of similar languages, a lot of similar themes, and you can understand each story a little better when you compare the two. And so I that was how I ended up approaching Kohelet. Is that after many years of finding Kohelet difficult, tedious, even didn't really connect to it. I'll even a little. One year, many years ago, I broke my glasses during a reading Kohelet because I fell asleep and I hit my head in the stender. So about 6 years ago, I said, and this is after having been more connected to Rabbi Foreman's approach. I came home from shul, and I said, I have to get something out of this book that every year. I know it's in here. I know we read it every year in Sukkot. We are intended to learn something from it, but I'm not getting out of it. I said, I have to find some way of finding some meaning in it that was missing for me. And so I just looked at the words as it was. I was at a relative's house who doesn't even have, he's a Talmid Chacham, but he's not a Tanakh scholar. He didn't have all the commentaries that I have. And so I just had the book. I just had the text of Kohelet. And I just had looking at it and realizing that there was something about it that reminded me of the opening chapters of Bereishis. The words were similar. The phrases were similar. Some of the Sukkim almost seemed like they were lifted from Bereishis and put into Kohelet. And that just seemed very curious to me. I was wondering, what's going on? Why is that the case? And so then the more I found these connections and started writing them down, I originally thought, maybe this will be a nice little Dvar Torah I'll give some night. And then I said, well, maybe it'll be a shir at one of my, chabruas that I go to. Or, okay, fine, maybe it'll be an article. But the evidence kept piling up. And I said, okay, this is likely to actually be a book. But there's enough here to really talk about. It's not a simple thing, but what does it all mean? And so I began to realize that it wasn't just linguistic connections between Kohelet and Bereishis, but it was thematic ones as well, in that the lives of Adam Rishon and Shlomo HaMelech were very similar. And those similarities led me to the conclusion that I kind of felt that Shlomo HaMelech, the attributed author of Kohelet, was echoing, channeling, whatever verb you feel appropriate to use, reflecting the life of Adam Rishon when he wrote Kohelet. That was the conclusion that I came to, and that was basically the main thesis of the book.
Right. So, and that's something that we'll dive into more, the parallels, and I'm interested in that. So, essentially, what you're saying is just from your interest in Tanakh, and then Koheles. You got interested in Koheles because of that, because you're like, what's going on every time we read Koheles? But I'm curious. We'll get to this more. But once you said this, I think it's you could clarify. Just as an example or one or two, what are the parallels between Koheles and Bereishis? You say, you saw right away some sort of parallel between the two. As an example, what's an example of that?
One of the examples is there's a pasuk in each which talks about, life coming from dust, returning to dust. That's a very strong connection. They talk about rivers flowing in a very similar way that the rivers are flowing in the description of Gan Eden. There's description of creation. If you look at the second chapter of Kohelet, it talks about all the things the king boasted he did. Those are very similar verbs used to the creation of the world. And of course, the life of Adam and in the garden and the sin is echoed very strongly. There's a lot of one of the main themes of Kohelet is I'd say there's probably four main themes of Kohelet. There's much of what we do in life is futile. Searching for knowledge doesn't lead to a positive end. Death is inevitable, and the right to suffer while the wicked prosper. And this idea of a search for knowledge, and the way he described search for knowledge, was also very reminiscent of the futile attempt to eat from the tree of knowledge. And so that echoed. And we can get into this more if you want later, but I think one of the things that seems anyone who reads Kohelet can't ignore the repetition of the word Hevel over and over and over again. And that word appear, as known as not, it's used in other places in Tanakh, but the first example and the most prominent example is the character Hevel, the son of Adam Rishon, who carries that same name. And this helped me once I understood these parallels between Bereishis and Kohelet, I better understood why Hevel was repeated in the way it is in Kohelet.
Yeah, I think that's what everyone, just not thinking anything else, just listening to Koheles, you always hear Hevel, Hevel, Hevel. So we'll get to that in a minute. I want to now I just wanted to follow up on that, but let's go back to Koheles being Shlomo HaMelech. And obviously it doesn't say Shlomo HaMelech at all in Koheles. Chazal say Koheles was Shlomo HaMelech. So you can talk about that a little, as you mentioned in the beginning. And then picking up on that, so I'll leave you that. And also, as you discuss in the book, the bio of Shlomo HaMelech's life is important to understanding Koheles.
That's right. So I do want to say a couple words about the question of authorship. I'm not naive to the question of the nature of some of the language of Kohelet. It does use language that is rather considered late Hebrew. I write a lot about language in my blog and other places. I know that it uses some words that are relatively late. But even within Chazal, there's opinions that Chizkiyahu Melech was the one who actually composed it, which is much later than Shlomo Melech. And there's even an opinion in Avot Rabbi Natan, which says that that the Anshe Knesset Gedolah were involved in it says Pirshu, but it means they were also involved in assembling it. It doesn't. So in that sense, the fact that it has later Hebrew doesn't. I'm not concerned about who was involved in the process. Whatever stages that was, they were clearly, even according to Chazal, taking Shlomo's words and using it potentially in modern parlance in a similar way that maybe somebody would take if somebody was doing they were talking like about life in Elizabethan England and they would write it in modern language. That wouldn't mean that they were trying. They were still making it clear that it was coming back to an earlier time. But it seems to me very clear that it's almost impossible for you to imagine that anyone else besides Shlomo was involved in writing it. It talks about how it opens by saying it's the sayings of Kohelet, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. And later it says, I, Kohelet, was king of Israel and Jerusalem. And the only son of David was to become king was Shlomo. And he was the only king in the line of David to become the ruler of all of Israel. But more importantly, Kohelet describes a wise king, a wealthy king with many wives who built extensively. And that clearly only applies to Shlomo. So I am concerned. I'm focusing on when I read Kohelet, I can't read Kohelet without thinking anyone besides Shlomo. And Shlomo's life, the Chazal famously describe how Shir Hashirim was written in his youth and Mishlei was written in his middle age and Kohelet was written to the end of his life. And that was how I understand Kohelet as well, in that it's definitely the sign of somebody looking back at the end of their life of what happened. It's not somebody who's looking forward, it's somebody who's looking back. And Shlomo had a lot of potential. By the way, this is what in some ways it makes him very similar to Adam Rishon, right? They both had tremendous potential. They both had universal scope in ways that no one else could be compared. Adam Rishon was obviously universal in the sense he was the first human, but Shlomo, he was known all over the world. And yet the tragedy was that after making poor decisions, he ended up in a state of is Chazal even say that he was deposed as king. There's even discussion whether an amazing discussion says that whether he was worthy of Olam Haba or not, all these things. So Shlomo would definitely have a reason to look back and say, what happened? How did I get here? I had such a close relationship with God that how to get to the place now where I'm worshiping, in my house we're worshiping idols and I'm deposed as the king and so on. And I think that possibly what led to this, and this is what I discussed in the book, is that search for knowledge, because that's exactly what Kohelet talks about. Searching for knowledge, at least in the way that Kohelet did it, was in vain, and that is what led Shlomo to his conclusions that it wasn't really worth it. And it's very ironic in a way that the wisest of all men, Shlomo, was the one who came to that conclusion, and that was sort of the tragedy of Shlomo.
Right, and you discussed this in the first chapter, and then in the second chapter, how Koheles is discussing Shlomo's youth and Shlomo's life throughout as well. There's like allusions to that as well, right?
Yeah, so, I should note, by the way, when you mentioned the first chapter, the second chapter, that I didn't write the book in the order of the chapters of Kohelet itself. There's a number of other books that have come out about Kohelet. Now, one is by one of the scholars who I most admire, Rabbi Professor Yoni Grossman, who I just drink up everything he writes. He has a new book that just came out in Hebrew on Kohelet. And I bumped into him a few weeks ago and I said, I really pity you because the way you had to write the book in order, and that's very, very challenging. But this is actually, I found a few places in the Mefarshim which talk about also how it wasn't written in order. But I very much describe that in that it's not meant to be written in order. And so when you mentioned the chapters, those are my chapters more than chapters of the book. I think the book, when people read Kohelet, they find it challenging and they find it difficult. It's because there is no regular order like a regular book of Tanakh. It's all over the place. And so I think that's the intention. I think there's a reason why that is. We can get into it later if you want, but I think there's a reason why. And so I don't think it has that order is the lack of order is an essential component of the book of Kohelet.
Right. Okay. So then let's go back. So that's, something you discussed in the beginning, and then let's go back to what you were mentioning before, how you noticed the parallels between Koheles and Bereishis, and you start off with Adam and Rishon. So you mentioned already how you made this connection and the connection, so you can obviously mention more connections than you mentioned, but I mean, we can start off with Adam and where you see Adam in Koheles, and then the parallels to Bereishis.
Right. So again, Adam also searched for knowledge, and his search for knowledge was what led to his failures. Right. He had their lives are so similar. They both reached out for things that didn't really belong to them. And through this desire for knowledge. Now, I should also make clear, and I discuss this more in the book. This is not the question of knowledge in the sense of just knowing things. Both in both the case of Shlomo and the case of Adam Rishon, it's out in a way we call it knowledge, but it really is a sense of judgment, judging what is discerning not what is true, what is false, but what is right and what is wrong. That was clearly what was Adam Rishon's sin. He was deciding on his own the tree of knowledge and good. It's dat tov v'ra. So no, is to be able to determine what is right and what is wrong. And Shlomo, similarly, very famously, and I think this is the pshat, is that Shlomo, talks about the Gemara in Sanhedrin, which talks about how, Shlomo decided that certain mitzvot didn't apply to him. He didn't have to worry about the laws of the king. It didn't apply. He did similar, maybe this is also what led to some of the looseness he had with terms of what was going on with his wives later on. And he also determined what was right and what was wrong. And those parallels in what's going on with Kohelet, which is described in Kohelet. Another parallel that I think is very strong is what happened to their children. Adam obviously had this friction between Kayin and Hevel, and Shlomo's children also had his literal child Rechavam and he. When it was close to Yeravam was close to him, and they ended up having the division. Those two things offer a similar parallel. And I think with Hevel specifically, as I mentioned, who's repeated, that I think one of the reasons, and I think by the way this also can help explain the structure of the book. The main sin, the main punishment for the sin in the Gan Eden, I think, was the introduction of death to the world. There were a number of punishments, but the most significant one was the introduction of death. And who was the first person to die? It wasn't Adam and it wasn't Chava. It was their son Hevel. And so in a sense, Hevel died as a result of Adam's sin. So I imagine going to going to a shiva of a person who's, if you go to a shiva of someone who's, an elderly parent, they're going to tell you stories from the beginning to end and be kind of, structured. If you go to a shiva of someone who lost a child, it's going to be very difficult. And certainly I've never done this, but I can imagine going to a shiva of someone who felt responsible for their child's death. They wouldn't be talking in a structured way. And so basically they would be going around in a lot of different, from here to there. And Hevel, when the repetition of Hevel in the book is basically Shlomo just saying, Hevel, my son, Hevel, what did I do? How did I get to, or echoing Adam saying, Hevel, my son, how did I get to this place? How did my sins lead to these terrible results?
Now, in the book as well, you have actually a number of your chapters where there are like boxes where you compare psukim in Koheles to psukim in Bereishis, and you actually show the parallels. I don't know if I want to mention any other ones, but again, it's in the book. For any listeners interested more can read the book. You actually show the parallels between those psukim, between Adam and Koheles.
Right, there are dozens of them. I mean, again, I don't know how well it'll come across the podcast, but just if I just flip through my book, I found there's issues of snakes, there's issues of nakedness, there's issues of eating, there's all kinds of things. There's wine. There's so many different lectures. Rabbi Foreman actually, I think, does a good job with it. He often compares this idea of intertextuality to solving a puzzle. When you solve a puzzle, the first thing you do is look for the corner pieces. The corner pieces are the ones they're very, very strong evidence. And then once you're done with the corners, you go to the sides. they might be a little less strong, but once you have the corners, you can build the sides. Once you build the sides, then you can go into the middle. It's very possible that I think just because I have a lot of evidence wouldn't necessarily make it convincing, but the fact that there's some very, very strong evidence that there's connections in terms of some of the verses that are lifted from one book to the other, and then other themes of they're mentioned, and then some of the other verses. I think I find that it's difficult to ignore those connections. Certainly, it was difficult for me.
Did you find any sources that talk about this intertextual connection between Bereishis and Koheles?
You mean like traditional sources? Yes,
yeah,
I did. I think first of all, there were midrashim that mentioned some of these things. I personally find that it's interesting. When I was much younger, maybe I was connected to midrashim. When I got older, I was a little bit skeptical, thinking, "Oh, that's just a midrash." It's a quote that's often attributed to Mark Twain, saying that my parents got smarter as I got older. And I thought, and I think the same. I view this midrash in the same way. I find the midrash much more sophisticated now than I did when I was younger. And I think that midrash is a classic. They use intertextuality in a very sophisticated way. But in addition, there's famously the Gra talks about connections between Bereshit and Kohelet as well. But again, in the way that those commentaries were written, they tend to be much more terse. They would only mention it, sort of as a hint. They didn't necessarily develop all of these connections. And then, in later scholarship, I would find an article or a book or someone who would mention it. But I don't think I ever found someone who did it systematically. Perhaps the closest I did was actually I found, after I finished writing the book, I listened to a speech by Rabbi Sachs, where he also mentioned a lot of connections between Bereshit and Kohelet. We ended up taking a slightly different path. I was hoping to discuss it with him, but unfortunately, he passed away before we had a chance to discuss it. So I credit him, but it didn't directly influence me because the book was already written at that point.
Right, and as should be clear by now, what's unique about your book is this unique approach of paralleling Koheles to Bereishis. So it's not just another commentary or another book on Koheles, it's kind of your own spin on it. So let's talk about Kayin and Hevel and the parallels there. And as you say, anyone that reads Koheles or listens on Sukkos, you're going to hear Hevel, Havolim, hakol, Hevel. Everything is Hevel, 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 Hevel. And then we have, like you say, Hevel, Adam's son, who Kayin kills. So what are the parallels between them and the name Hevel of Adam's son, etc.?
Right. So the parallels are, like I mentioned, there's parallels in terms of the friction between Kayin and Hevel and the successors to Shlomo. There's a lot of verbs that are used there in terms of if you look at there's similar verbs about a sadeh, and there's similar verbs about lakum. When it talks about Shlomo's successors, it's not just Yerovam, but the two successors, the two attempts to people who challenged him before. It mentions Sayakom. I know, like, lakum is not a rare word, but it's used repeatedly in a similar way that talks about Kayin is kam basadeh, and so there's a lot there, but that's there. In terms of Hevel, I would like to just mention, I think that sometimes that it might be a little bit. One thing that came to me when I was writing is why would Adam name his son Hevel in the first place? That's a difficult question. And the actual meaning of the word Hevel, while it's generally translated in Kohelet as ability or vanity, the real meaning of it is breath. Like Hevel Piv is someone's actual breath that comes out of their mouth. So I came up with an idea. I didn't see it anyplace else, but I think it's a reasonable explanation that the Chazal say, and I think this is the pshat that they're potentially likely the pshat that because it mentions that Chava was pregnant once, and gave birth twice. So she was pregnant with Kayin. It says pregnant and then gave birth to Kayin and gave birth later to Hevel. It doesn't mention she was pregnant a second time. And from this, Chazal learned that Kayin and Hevel were twins. And there's certainly kind of parallels later in the Torah of twins having tension. With, let's say, famously Yaakov and Esau. So I was imagining a scenario where, a difficult birth. Hevel is Kayin is born, and there's another child, and can imagine how difficult that birth would be. They're not sure maybe the kid is even going to survive, and then suddenly he breathes. So it'd be an amazing name to give the child the name of Hevel, the name of breath. But then in the end, just as breath is fleeting, it ended up being Hevel's life was fleeting as well.
Right, and that really is something that life is fleeting, or Hevel, futile, whatever in Koheles. So then you continue on with the end of Adam's life, and then we'll get to the other famous part of Koheles of lakol, zman, ve'ez. But first, you can talk about the end of Adam's life and the parallels to Koheles.
Right. So I think in the end of Adam's life is actually it's more about what's not said than what is said. And this is one of the things that I thought was another thing in common between Adam and Shlomo. We never find out what Adam, after the punishment he receives when he's kicked out of the garden, we don't find anything. We don't hear Adam's opinion about what he thought about his life with Chava. Does he blame her? Does he not? That also, I think, is reflected in Kohelet, where his ambivalent relationship to women. Sometimes he praises them and sometimes he doesn't. Maybe he blames her for what happens in the garden. We don't know what he thinks about life outside the garden. We don't know what he thinks about losing Hevel. We don't know what he thinks about anything because we don't hear a speech. We don't hear tshuva. We don't hear anything. And similarly with Shlomo, we don't hear. Shlomo gets a big punishment at the in the last chapter was mentioned in Perek Yud Aleph and Malachim. We don't hear anything about Shlomo after. We don't hear him doing tshuva. We don't hear how he reacts to everything that happened. And so I think that Kohelet is essentially Shlomo's attempt to do tshuva. In other words, he's saying, look, I made a lot of mistakes in my life. I identify with Adam Rishon, who also made a lot of mistakes in their life. We have a similar connection, a very unique connection to God. We were two people who had a tremendous intimacy with God that almost no one else in history could really compare it to. We had lived in God's special place. Adam lived in the garden. I built the Beit HaMikdash. Who else would be able to have a life like that? And yet we blew it. We lost it. And the losing of that connection is something that they must have both regret. It's kind of like you can imagine a scenario where somebody might have had a relationship with a spouse, and that relationship was eventually through betrayal was lost. And for the momentary loss that they gave for the betrayal, looking back at their life, they might have said, how did I let this happen? How did I lose something that was so special to me? And Kohelet, if you read Kohelet the way that I understand it being read, from beginning to end, it's advice about how to avoid the mistakes that I made, and how to avoid, in essence, all the mistakes that Adam Rishon made.
Now, the other, I guess, one of the most famous parts of Kohelet is lakol zman v'ez. Right, lakol zman v'ez, lakol chivas takas hashemayim, for every season, every time, there's a place. So, what are the parallels there? You see some parallels. You see parallels between that, the list there in Koheles, and then in Bereishis.
Right. So it's interesting. I found that a lot of the verbs used in that famous chapter are mentioned in Bereishis as well. We talk about planting. We talk about building. There's lishmor, to keep, which is that was Adam's mission in the garden. We talk about killing, which obviously is what happened to Hevel. There's sewing, which is what God, there's God makes them garments. But what was interesting to me is if you make these connections, it's almost like a puzzle. In other words, there was some very strong connections in this. Some of the verbs are so strongly related to what's going on with Adam and with Kayin and Hevel that what about the other verbs? So the way I read it was, it's almost like Kohelet is like a midrash on Bereishis. I've heard this before. They say the first midrash is actually the Tanakh is a midrash on the other books of Tanakh are often a midrash on the Torah itself. And so, I said, for example, how might Adam recall the happier days before Hevel died? Well, he was happy, he was laughing and dancing, but how did he react to Hevel's death? With weeping, with tearing his clothes, sitting in silence. He regretted, he wished he could embrace his children, but now he refrained from embracing Kayin because he wasn't there, and so on. Maybe he gathered stones to place in Hevel's grave. And I even speculated that perhaps, and this is not, there's a midrash that mentions that maybe that Hevel was killed, but that Kayin killed Hevel with a stone. So, if you do a kind of connect the dots, you can find a lot of parallels in the book, in that chapter, that eventually sort of start filling in the gaps into the stories of Adam and Kayin and Hevel.
So as you've explained, it's you see a parallel between the two, between Bereishis and Koheles. Yet Shlomo wrote Koheles is perplexing. He hides his identity. It's perplexing. It's written in interesting ways. What are the reasons for that, and what are the reasons that you think that for the parallels?
I think that it does. Again, it's if we only talked about Shlomo, I think it would be difficult to really identify with. In other words, by finding parallels with other biblical stories. And by the way, in the book, I also mentioned another set of stories which we haven't really gotten into yet, which is the story of the spies. It's another case where a search for knowledge about the land led to similar tragedy, and so also going for fruit and this clothing, a lot of similar elements. By tying in, by layering the story of Kohelet with other biblical stories, it allows a much richer reading. And everyone is connected to Adam Rishon. It allows maybe people are familiar with those stories. I can't say for sure why it was written specifically this way. It might have been also the sort of the the style, the way things are written. At times, sometimes things are a little esoteric. Perhaps there's a little bit of the tension about how to deal with someone like Shlomo being, deposed. Chazal have a very difficult time with themselves. They debate whether to include the book of Kohelet in Tanakh. They debate whether Shlomo HaMelech was worthy of Olam Haba. They say that it's full of contradictions. But on the other hand, Shlomo was David's son. We have the line of Davidic kings. Mashiach is going to come from there. We have all this. We don't want to reject the very essence of Beit David. To have a book that was so critical of Shlomo to the point that he would be, rejected would be potentially a little bit dangerous. So to have things written in a more esoteric way, the Rambam talks a lot about this. Why the Tanakh is written, different chapters are written in a way that isn't necessarily as obvious. And sometimes it's a pride, a more superficial reading, and a deeper reading, you can get more deeper messages. So I think that's part of what's going on here.
So also, as you mentioned, you do draw some other parallels as well. You draw parallels between to Meraglim. You draw and then you discuss the Meraglim a little bit in the story of the Hashem to tell them to send them, etc. You end up discussing things about the Beitz Hadas. You discuss wine. You discuss tzitzis. I mean, you can mention some of this or not. I mean, the overarching point is what you've been saying, the parallel between Bereishis and Koheles. But there are some other discussions in the book as well, and some other parallels that you make as well, besides for just the Bereishis to Koheles connection.
That's correct. I think that the idea, basically, I'll try to say in a nutshell, is that these various stories, the three main stories that I discussed are, again, the Adam Rishon, the story of the Meraglim, and the story of Shlomo HaMelech, with a lot of parallels. And I think that the purpose of Kohelet is to find a remedy to these common failings. And what the Torah provides, the classic example is, I think, and this is something that's generally familiar to people, is that you have in the story of the spies ends with the mitzvah tzitzit, which is sort of like a way of repairing that error. If you look at tur acharei lovchem, is the tur for the spies, and the tur, that verb, also appears in Kohelet. But I found that by looking through the Torah, there's a number of mitzvot that are ways of, if we follow those particular mitzvot, we can also avoid those same failings, those same errors. And I discuss a lot about tzitzit. I talk a lot about the laws of the king, by the way, which don't only apply to the king, but the warnings apply to everyone as well. And I discuss extensively also the Yom Kippur service, because I think the Yom Kippur service is a way to sort of also have us return to a state that was like in Gan Eden before the expulsion. These mitzvot are a way for us to repair that relationship, that intimacy that I mentioned that both Shlomo and Adam Rishon lost. That's something that is relevant to us today. We all would like to be able to restore our connection to Hashem, and that's something that these mitzvot allow us to do.
So you called the book, it's Kohelet, a map to Eden. What does that mean, a map to Eden?
Well, basically, as I mentioned, I think it's a way. Adam would have loved to get back to Eden after being expelled. Shlomo had built a replica of Eden in the Beit HaMikdash. I talk a lot about how the Mishkan was like Gan Eden, or the creation of the world, and the Beit HaMikdash was the extension of that, and Shlomo lost his connection to that, and they want to return to that special place. So via the advice in Kohelet and the mitzvot that are either alluded to or have parallels to in the stories of Shlomo and the stories of Adam, like I said, like tzitzit, like the service on Yom Kippur. There's a number of other mitzvot that I mentioned in the book that allows us to not physically return to Gan Eden, but allows us to spiritually do so by reestablishing that connection to God, and that is what Kohelet is about. It's a way to return to the pre-sin state. I mean, if you talk about it in Yom Kippur, it's almost very clear. The Kohen Gadol is going in. He's free of sin. He's if you take, for example, let's say if you look at the scapegoat, the Seir Lazazel, when those goats are chosen, the Kohen Gadol isn't the one who chooses what's good and bad. He lets God. That's the goral. That's the lottery decide what is good and bad. That's the rectification of the sin where Adam decided what was right and what was wrong, and Shlomo decided what was right. But the sin what was right and was wrong, and he lets God do that. There's a number of these parallels. So that's the idea. We want to find a way to return to that pre-sin state of Eden. That's why I call it a map to Eden, because by following the directions of Kohelet, we have a way to sort of return to that state.
Now, you include an appendix about why Koheles is read on Sukkos, and that kind of can be is there a connection? Let's talk about the connection there between what we've been discussing here, this kind of intertextual between Bereishis and Koheles, and kind of, why Koheles is read on Sukkos.
Okay, so I'm not going into necessarily the historical answer why Kohelet is read on Sukkot. I don't know if that's the case, but I'll say one thing. If I had to choose a Megillah to read on Sukkot, it would definitely be Kohelet. Like, that's for sure. There's a number of different answers given, but I think that the main thing is that if you look at the connection, if you look at, let's say, the laws of the king has a number of prohibitions of what he's not supposed to do. He's not supposed to amass gold and horses and wives. These are signs of the dangers of affluence, the dangers of abundance. And in what's interesting is that in the earlier in Sefer Dvarim, before the laws of the king, you have a very similar language. It's in Parshat I think, where basically they talk about you have to, it's going to talk about you're going to increase your silver and gold. You're going to your herds and flocks will multiply, which is similar to the horses, and it says that you're going to prosper and you're going to grow haughty. You're going to be ram levavcha, which is actually the same language that's talked about to the king. So the warnings of the king is not limited to the king. It also applies to the people in general when they enter the land. And you're going to forget God who took you out of the land of Egypt. The interesting thing, though, is that the one other description of the affluence, of the abundance mentioned in Parshat V'etchanan, or Parshat Ekev, is you're going to build houses. And that isn't mentioned in the laws of the king. The king is not prescribed against building houses, but there's a real risk in building houses. That's something that is a very interesting thing I noticed looking through Tanakh. We don't see almost anyone building houses in Tanakh. You see a very brief mention of Yaakov Avinu building a house, but he built a house and then they call the place Sukkos, which I think is significant here. And then from that time, from Yaakov Avinu building a house, we don't see the narrative description from building a house until David and Shlomo. And the risk of building a house is you feeling of, this house is mine, this house belongs to me, I feel I am the balabait, literally. And that's what Sukkot comes to warn us against. It's not only applies to our personal homes, it applied even to the Beit HaMikdash as well. Shlomo was building his Beit HaMikdash, but who was he doing it for? How did this work out? The Chazal criticized him for spending more time building his own home than building the Beit HaMikdash. But the people were certainly oppressed by the fact that it was, all the significant taxes to build the Beit HaMikdash. And if you look at the when the prophet speaks to David HaMelech about building the Beit HaMikdash, Hashem says something shocking, which I think a lot of people don't pay attention to. David says he wants to build Hashem a home. It can't be that, he says that how is it possible that you're not in a home yet, that there's not a house for you? And Hashem says, look, just understand, I never asked for a house. I was satisfied in being an OL. The house is for you. It's not for me. You want a house? You have to deal with the consequences of having a house. It's not without risk. And so that I think applies as well. That I think is the message of Sukkot. When we leave our own houses, our own sense of confidence, we go outside. We don't. We have to also remember our dependence on God, and that we're not the balabait anymore. And I think that makes it so relevant to Sukkot and so relevant to Kohelet, because that's what the message of Kohelet is. like I said, in chapter 2 of Koheles, he talks about, I built this, and I planted this, and I did this, and I did this. And in the end, he said it was all for nothing because he wasn't the one who did it. That's really what God did. We have to remember to reconnect to that, the dangers of affluence and the dangers of not self confidence, but of feeling the ownership of things that weren't really our doing.
Very interesting. So, like you're saying, it's not that's your kind of spin on things here. Why we're reading Koheles and Sukkos, but there's obviously other reasons as well, and you include that chapter as an appendix. Let me just ask you, like, what sources do you use? Is just like, or I mean, you kind of said before, this kind of intertextual thing. It comes up in Mefarshim, but it's kind of also your thing. But what about it in general? Different Makaris. You mentioned Midrashim, others.
I looked at everything I could, everything I could get my hands on. That's what I learned in my yeshiva is like, I used to walk up I'd walk up and down the aisles to just open every book when I was there. And so now I kind of replicate that in my house or replicate it online by looking at, the various online sources that I can get anything, every commentary, articles, books. I would go to the National Library in Jerusalem and just pick up everything I could get, but I think it's important to know what your questions are. I'm not looking just to say what someone else said. I have questions that I'm looking for answers. But I think it's one of the most important things for anyone who's taking on any sort of Torah study, whether it's, and this is, by the way, not only applies to Tanakh, it applies to Gemara, it applies to anything. You need to have that inherent natural curiosity. You have to be bothered by things. And once you're bothered by things, then you can look for the solutions that other people gave. But if you don't have the question yourself, you're never going to really search out for those answers. I think that's something that I learned, and it propels me. Every time I give a Torah, I want to have that question. You need to first have the question, and then you can go searching for the answers. But when you have that question, you're likely to come up with your own chidushim. Maybe you'll have an answer maybe you'll have a question that nobody ever thought about before. And that's the kind of thing that I, was able to come up with. So I think that it's interesting. There's actually a fascinating thing. I wish I included the book. I don't know. I read Rashi. Obviously, I read Rashi's commentary on Koheles, but I never paid attention to this very interesting comment that he made. I don't know. Again, this is part of Chiddush, that you learn something new every time you read it. So Rashi says that when the first time is mentioned about Tachat Hashemesh, under the heavens, he says that there's nothing new under the heavens, but there is something new when it comes to learning Torah. Every time you study Torah, you can develop some new answers. And so I felt like I'm a part of that chain of tradition of coming up with something new. It's a burden, it's a responsibility, but it's also a tremendous privilege to be able to maybe potentially through my readers be able to have some new insights into this difficult book.
Yeah, and it's definitely, as we've been discussing here, and any listener interested can check out the book to see more. It's kind of a unique approach. It's something new, a little different. It's not kind of just your standard, reading of Koheles. So I'll link to the book in the show's notes if anyone is interested in purchasing it. And thank you for joining me to discuss Koheles and your approach to it.
It was really my pleasure. I really enjoyed the talk.